Most offseasons, one or two veteran free agent defensive tackles linger on the open market and don't end up signing with a team until later in the summer. But not this year. And as a result, the Chicago Bears are going to have to rely heavily on Gervon Dexter.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on X at CoxSports1, and you can follow Locked On Bears at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. On the show today, we look at what's still in store for this Chicago Bears defensive line and why the way this offseason has played out, the Bears are certainly going to heavily rely on Gervon Dexter to take a big step forward in year two. We'll look at how the free agent market has completely dried up. It's like remarkable how few talented, reliable, experienced defensive tackles there are in really any capacity whatsoever. And that leaves the Bears' primary path to addressing that position as the NFL draft. But do you use an early draft pick on a position after you just used a second-round pick at that position last year? But is Gervon Dexter ready to take over like a big-time key role in this Chicago Bears defensive line? And we'll also look at what could still be in store at defensive end, where there's still a need, but still a little bit more opportunity to add at that position, both with some names left in free agency that aren't exciting, but are still better than what you got at defensive tackle, and then also the NFL draft. We'll look for some potential solutions to how Ryan Poles can still finish this Chicago Bears defensive line. But you're not going to see the Bears go out and add a defensive tackle before the NFL draft, or I should say a defensive tackle with any kind of like experience or proven reliability or production. You know, last year we saw Ryan Poles wait until this time of the month, this time of the draft process, to sign Rasheem Green as a free agent from the Houston Texans. I believe that was on April 6th last season, so still like a few more days before we even got to that date. So, right, Ryan Poles is always still keeping an eye on the free agent market and negotiating with guys, and we could still see the Bears sign some kind of veteran free agent defensive lineman or elsewhere to a one-year deal like they did last year with Rasheem Green. But that's not likely to happen at the defensive tackle position because there just really isn't free agent talent out there. Like I was combing through the remaining free agents, the unsigned players on the defensive line, and there's some defensive ends who we'll get to a little bit while later here on the podcast. But like when it comes to defensive tackles, there's really only one player that has any kind of decent production, any kind of like starting experience or playing some significant production in a rotation. And that's a defensive tackle by the name of Teair Tart. I believe it's pronounced Teair. He was a defensive tackle for the Tennessee Titans for the first 4 seasons of his career, but then like kind of had this weird falling out with the Titans and then spent the end of this season with the Houston Texans. And even him, he's only had 2.5 career sacks, but at least he's been a starter for the Tennessee Titans. But like, that's it. It's him and a bunch of guys who barely made rosters, or if they barely made rosters, they barely played. Or, there's a couple of like more like nose tackle types, but the Bears are pretty set at nose tackle, with Andrew Billings, and I think Zach Pickens is going to kind of compete at that spot, but there just really isn't defensive tackle depth left that has anything that you can get excited about beyond that. And Tart comes with some very significant red flags there. There were some questions about, whether or not he was really motivated to play football, whether he was, does he actually love the game? Was he trying very hard out there? Like those kind of red flags that the Chicago Bears avoid as much as any other team in the NFL. The rest of that list of free agent defensive tackles is like, I mean, could you talk Fletcher Cox out of retirement? Like that's kind of where we get to. Like Raheem Nunez-Roches from the New York Giants, who's played some snaps, I guess, but a backup guy doesn't get sacks, doesn't get after the quarterback. Hassan Ridgeway from the Texans, like not a productive player at all. Like it's really scraping the bottom of the barrel when it comes to free agent defensive tackles. You're not going to find a starter by any means, and you're not really going to find a guy that you feel super great about being a big member of your rotation. Like the Bears have already signed two of those kind of journeyman backup guys who don't play a ton at that spot to be Gervon Dexter's backups at this point. They signed Byron Cowart, C-O-W-A-R-T, not Coward, but Cowart, who has played, here and there. He was a fourth-round pick, I think, or a fifth-round pick a handful of years ago, day 3 from the Patriots, and then was on 4 different practice squads last season, bouncing around with the Chiefs and the Texans and the Dolphins before coming to the Bears this year. Like he hasn't really played all that much as of late. He's played some in his career, but not like a guy that you think is for sure going to make the 53-man roster in any capacity. And then they also brought in a Michael Dwumafor, who was on the Bears practice squad last year, if I'm not mistaken, or has bounced around some other practice squads as well, but didn't really play any defensive snaps for any team last season. That's your defensive tackle room right now. And there's not a free agent out there that can come in and really solidify that in any way that you have any sort of confidence in. It's just more guys like that. You could sign another version of a Byron Cowart from some other team that you've never heard of before that has about as much experience and about as much production, but that's really it. So it's Gervon Dexter. He's your top interior pass rusher. That is the plan right now. The only other option you have is the NFL draft, where you've got the 9th overall pick, and then you've got a 3rd-round pick and a 4th-round pick. And you could take a defensive tackle like a Byron Murphy with your 1st-round pick out of Texas, but are you going to invest a 1st-round pick at a position that you invested a top, I guess it wasn't technically a top 50 pick. I think Dexter was like 51 or 52, but basically like a top 50 pick the year before. Dexter was pick 53, as I fact check myself live here. You just use the 53rd pick on a defensive tackle pass rusher. Are you going to use a 1st-round pick, a top 10 pick at that same position, and essentially destine Gervon Dexter to be a backup, to be a rotational player like this? Sure, we've seen teams double dip at defensive tackle, namely the Philadelphia Eagles last season with Jalen Carter, after already having Fletcher Cox and having drafted Jordan Davis the year before. But I think the idea with them was that Davis and Jalen Carter would be their 2 defensive tackles long term. The Bears drafted their 2 defensive tackles last season, Zach Pickens and Gervon Dexter. But year 2 feels pretty early to just throw Gervon Dexter out there and say, okay, you went from rotational backup to, all right, now you're the most important interior pass rusher on this team. Go out there and get some sacks. Like we knew Dexter was more of a raw, developmental defensive tackle prospect, someone who's going to need time to reach his full potential. And I'm not sure the guy we saw last season, he made some great flashes and improved as the year went on, showed really important progress. But I'm not sure we left week 18, right? Week 18, that's weird. It's still weird to say that. We didn't leave week 18 feeling like, yep, this guy is ready to go. He's just chomping at the bit to become the starter on this team. It felt like this offseason you needed someone else in there. Either it didn't have to be, Chris Jones from the Chiefs, but we were all ready to sign Chris Jones if he had hit the open market. But you felt like you wanted somebody in there to either be the starter ahead of Dexter or be a veteran who's going to rotate in and split time, maybe 50-50, right? That veteran who's starting caliber, and maybe it's a blurry line between who's the starter and who's the backup, but both guys are going to play, so it's not all on Dexter. But right now, it's all on Dexter, and his only hope for help is a rookie. I'm not sure that's the best possible approach for the Bears, but I understand Ryan Poles can't do everything all at once, but he can still address the defensive end position, both in the draft and in free agency. So we'll look at this defensive line need as a whole and what options are still available there for Ryan Poles next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at BetterHelp. BetterHelp provides online therapy that can help you be your best self. I do online therapy every single week, and it's a really important part of my own personal mental health regimen that I cannot recommend strongly enough to you or anyone who might need it. I always like to compare going to therapy is like going to the gym for my brain. I don't go to the gym because my body is broken or because, my body's in crisis or anything, but I go to the gym because I want my body to heal or to be at its best, to be stronger, right? To become its full self. And I go to therapy for the same reason for my brain, right? Not because it's broken, but because I want to be my best and because I want my mental health to be stronger too. So if you've been thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited right to your schedule. So learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Gervon Dexter is going to be tasked with helping this Bears interior pass rush take the next step and be better than what it was last season with Justin Jones. Essentially, it's the same three defensive tackles minus Justin Jones. They haven't added anyone of note or of repute on this defensive tackle position, and it's otherwise the same three guys as before. It still feels like the Bears need to address that position in some way, shape, or form. It's just a matter of whether that's with the 9th overall pick or maybe a 3rd round pick or a 4th round pick, or if they trade down at some point and acquire more picks, different opportunities to add more talent there. You need more talent there. I just don't know that Ryan Poles is going to pull the trigger on a 1st round pick there at the number 9 pick unless, an edge rusher like Dallas Turner's off the board or an offensive tackle like Joe Alt is off the board, or if the wide receivers, Rome Odunze, Marvin Harrison, Malik Neighbors, if they're all off the board, then Byron Murphy enters that conversation. We went through that conversation yesterday on the podcast as we put together a Chicago Bears NFL Draft big board. So go back and take a listen to that to kind of see where Byron Murphy falls into that conversation and why it feels like if the Bears stay at number 9, still doesn't feel that likely that he's going to be the pick because there's going to be better options available, more talented players for the Bears. And you're not just going to reach for a defensive tackle because you feel like you really need to address the defensive tackle with the 9th overall pick. I just don't see that as likely. So it's going to be the Gervon Dexter show. But one of the best ways the Bears can support Gervon Dexter, if you're going to make him that primary 3-technique pass rusher, is giving him even more help at the defensive end positions where there's also still a hole on this Bears roster. There's not really that starter opposite Montez Sweat that you feel really good about. Like right now, you pencil in DeMarcus Walker as that starter, who the Bears signed last offseason, but clearly even last offseason realized maybe not the starter they want at the defensive end spot, so they went out and got Unique Ngakoue to try and fill that spot out even farther, and of course then trading for Montez Sweat as well, really moved Walker to the bench, and ideally, DeMarcus Walker is your number 3 defensive end. And then you've got someone else starting opposite Sweat, and then Walker can rotate in with them, and then Dominic Robinson can be like your number 4. They signed Jake Martin. He could be a potential number 4 as well. It's kind of he versus Dominic Robinson for that role. And then that feels like a more well-defined, holistic, talented defensive end room to then give you more outside pass rush so that you get more one-on-ones and less, I would say less pressure on, but pressure is kind of a dual word here, but lower expectations then that Dexter has to be as disruptive on the interior up the middle. There is still an opportunity for Ryan Poles to sign a veteran free agent defensive end of varying caliber, but still more talent at that position than what we're seeing at the free agent defensive tackle spot. And I'll remind you again, it was It was April 6th last offseason that Ryan Poles added Rasheem Green. And not that Rasheem Green was the answer or the savior at the defensive end position. I mean, he became kind of the 4th defensive end in that rotation. But still showing that Ryan Poles doesn't just stop. Now that free agency has been quiet, doesn't mean they're just done before draft day. They could still decide, one of these guys is ultimately going to be worth it. We just saw, Derek Barnett, the defensive end, come off the market yesterday and Monday as teams are still kind of negotiating with these guys. So you never know if the Bears could still address defensive end in free agency to add a little bit more veteran depth there to then maybe just make the entire defensive line's job easier. But if you look at some of the names still out there in free agency, and again, like Derek Barnett just signed, so some of these other names on the list, by the time you listen to this podcast, could still sign. But as of the time I'm recording this, as far as my research could tell, these players are all still free agents. I think the best player, the most talented player would be Calais Campbell from the Atlanta Falcons, but he 37, turns 38 in September, so very much aging end of his career pass rusher, but he had 6.5 sacks last season as the starting defensive end for the Falcons, and has been a consistent, 5 or 6 sack guy even throughout his aging years. And at his peak, a 14 sack guy. We've seen him be an all-pro. He's a defensive player of the year candidate. He's been a Pro Bowler a bunch. Like, we know Calais Campbell's very good. We just don't know exactly how much longer he's going to have, and certainly going to be 1 year at a time. And will he want to come to Chicago? Like, I'm not counting on that, but I think he's the most talented player still out there. And then it gets uglier from there in terms of guys that, you don't love the production, but maybe you take a chance on because you feel like there's still something there. Carl Lawson from the Jets. Last season, he only played in 6 games and really fell out of favor there, but just 2 years ago, 2022, he had 7 sacks. Year before that, 5.5. Year before that, 5. Like, he's been a pretty productive pass rusher, and he's only 28. I guess he turns 29 in June, but still, okay. Maybe there's more there to him as a guy who could come to Chicago and try and rebound a little bit in his career. One of the other bigger names out there is Mike Dana from the Kansas City Chiefs, who was like their starter this past season, a defensive end, just in his 4th year at age 26. He had 6.5 sacks, a career best year. This was his first year as the starter for them. And I think everyone was kind of expecting the Chiefs would give him a nice little decent payday this offseason. That, like, okay, he worked his way from, true backup to kind of rotational pass rusher to now starter, and got incrementally better as a starter on a Super Bowl champion defense. And we're in April, and he still hasn't signed yet. So that's been kind of the interesting way that's played out at this point. Like, everyone's kind of wondering what's going on there and why that market hasn't become bigger. Was he just doing the Chiefs a solid for them to trade L'Jarius Sneed and then free up more salary cap space? But it's been like a week now. So what are they waiting for? Like, I think that could definitely be something where, if things fell apart with Kansas City, he's close enough to, he's a starting caliber player. He's not elite, but he's certainly a starting caliber player that some of the Bears could take a look at. Some other names on the list, though, as well, in terms of top remaining defensive ends. Jerry Hughes from the Houston Texans didn't have a great year last year, but played with Bears defensive line coach Eric Washington with the Buffalo Bills for a couple of seasons. Another older player, I think he's like 36, about to be 37. So you're not getting a young player there. Turns 36 in August, I believe. Not a guy who's a starter anymore, wasn't a starter for Houston, but a veteran to rotate in with Walker and with Sweat and just kind of keep another fresh body in there with some production in his past. We'll also throw in Emmanuel Ogbah from the Miami Dolphins, who, again, kind of no longer a starter, but he's had some pretty decent sack numbers in his career. He's never been very good against the run, though, so I'm not sure he's exactly what Matt Eberflus might be looking for from the defensive end position. So, it's messy, it's ugly, but at least there's some veteran names there. And the one that's still kind of lingering through all this is Yannick Ngakoue. He is still a free agent out there. Did not have a good season with the Bears last year, but they know what he's like. They know what he's capable of. They know who he is. He's not a risk in terms of like an outside guy that you're not sure what he's got left in the tank or whatever. Like, the devil in this case, as opposed to the devil you don't, and someone like, Carl Lawson or someone like Jerry Hughes or something like that. Like, a reunion, we can't totally leave that off of the table, but I think Ngakoue may wait a little while, just like he did last year, to see when his options might come up. But one way or another, it would be nice to see the Bears really address this defensive line with some sort of significant resource. And we know there's not really free agent defensive tackles to invest in. The defensive end market isn't a lot to invest in, but at least it could be something more than what they've done so far. Or it leaves the 9th overall pick in the draft, whether that's staying there and drafting Dallas Turner from Alabama, or Leatu Latu from UCLA, or Jared Verse from Florida State as kind of the top 3 edge guys in this draft, or drafting the defensive tackle Byron Murphy from Texas that we talked about, or maybe trading down and taking someone like Johnny Newton from Illinois, or trading down and taking any of these other pass rushers that might still be there. It just feels like the main position that hasn't been significantly invested in this offseason that remains a really big need. And we saw them not really, they tried to address it last offseason and could only do so much. And I'm willing to give Ryan Poles some benefit of the doubt there and recognize that Montez Sweat was also kind of the big investment. Using, this year's second-round pick to get Montez Sweat is part of that equation, but it still needs more. And I'd like to see more go into this defensive line, especially to try and help Gervon Dexter if he's going to really be your top interior defensive tackle. And I think there's a way to work this where you hybridize the Bears' defensive line a little bit, and you can kind of find a solution where, okay, maybe you don't want to address defensive tackle with the 9th overall pick because you just drafted Dexter. You don't want to address defensive tackle because the free agent market is not very good. But maybe there's ways you can still kind of build out this defensive line more holistically and scheme your way to a better pass rush without having to rely overly on blitzing. We'll kind of find where we might be able to find some kind of hybrid solution here with more investment in defensive end to ultimately then give you more playing time at defensive tackle next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. The sports calendar is loaded, and FanDuel is making it even more exciting to get in on the action. Because right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. So you bet a $5 bet for anything, you win that bet. Not only do you get your winnings on that $5 bet, but then they'll add an extra $200 in bonus bets right into your account that you can use to bet on either the college basketball tournaments, Major League Baseball season's underway, basketball season's winding down with the playoffs around the corner. Hockey season is right in the same boat there, and so much more, including a bunch of NFL draft prop bets as well. So the football betting never stops on FanDuel either. So to collect your $200 in bonus bets, just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a big win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. The Bears might not be able to get a true great defensive tackle to pair with Gervon Dexter. Again, Byron Murphy's kind of, and maybe Johnny Newton, but like that's your only option to really get a replacement like starter, someone who's going to clearly start above Gervon Dexter. But when you think about the defensive line a little bit more as a whole and what you're asking these guys to do and what you need out of each position, I still think there's a recipe here where Ryan Poles can get this defensive line to a satisfactory place. I mean, is it satisfactory right now? That word I'm stuck on a little bit. But to get to this defensive line to a better place where you can feel a little bit more confident, as opposed to right now, it feels like you're scraping by just relying on Dexter, not really having any three technique depth, and you're scraping by relying on DeMarcus Walker as your starter. Is that make him the worst defensive line in football? No, I don't think so, but I've got some real question marks at those spots. But to still be able to address the defensive line in a way to make you feel good about the group as a whole is to rely on some of the positional versatility that you already have, while also then investing in the defensive end position, because it really feels like it's not great business to take a defensive tackle with the 9th overall pick. It's so much investment in three technique defensive tackles that kind of play one spot there that, you have two defensive ends. You have two defensive tackles, but one's the nose tackle. You're not drafting a nose tackle. You're drafting the other defensive tackle position. Use a first-round pick there. Sure, talent wins out and get the best player available. If he's truly the best player, take him. But it feels to me unlikely that the Bears are going to draft a defensive tackle with the 9th overall pick or in the first round at all. And so if you're not going to be able to get a true investment at defensive tackle, then invest heavily at defensive end and use the versatility of the defensive ends that you have. Mainly DeMarcus Walker, a player who, prior to coming to the Chicago Bears with the Tennessee Titans, played a lot of three technique defensive tackle. I was looking back at the playing time usage of how they used him in Tennessee. It was about 60-40. He's about 60% of the time defensive end, 40% of the time defensive tackle. That fluctuated year to year. That's not it's not hard accurate to the entire course of his career, but it's a good way it's a good thumb rule, thumb measurement, way to think about it, right? 60-40 defensive end, defensive tackle. Last year with the Bears, his first year in Chicago, he was 90-10 defensive end. They kicked him inside occasionally, but because they had Billings and Pickens and Justin Jones and Gervon Dexter, you wanted to get the rookies a lot of playing time, and the veterans were the starters, so there wasn't as much opportunity to move DeMarcus Walker inside. But they did it on some passing downs. Again, it was 10-11% of his snaps last season, mostly on passing downs. But we've seen from his time in Tennessee, he could handle 40% on the interior. So if you took DeMarcus Walker and made him, could you bump him up to 50-50 even? Made him a defensive tackle on passing downs, made Gervon Dexter your defensive tackle on rushing downs because he's a little bit bigger, a little bit more stout, stronger against the run. But then on passing downs, make DeMarcus Walker a defensive tackle to where you could have Gervon Dexter and Walker pass rushing from the interior. You could have Dexter get some breaks on those downs and have Walker be one and then, Andrew Billings be the other or Zach Pickens be the other. Can you use DeMarcus Walker as that rotational veteran player where Gervon Dexter is still your starting defensive tackle, but DeMarcus Walker is really, your 1B rotational veteran defensive tackle in there who's going to split a lot of snaps with Dexter. And maybe over the course of the season, they end up playing about the same amount of snaps, 50-50 in terms of who's playing the three technique snaps this year. Maybe it's, Gervon Dexter and DeMarcus Walker end up playing, a similar amount of those snaps, or Walker plays a significant number of those to kind of just give someone else some depth there. So it doesn't have to be all Gervon Dexter all the time trying to do all of your production at that three technique spot. If you're going to do that, then, as the depth chart stands right now, you're taking your starting defensive end, DeMarcus Walker, and kicking him inside more, which means you'll need that other defensive end opposite Montez Sweat to kind of carry some of the weight there. And again, they don't have that guy right now because as it stands, it's Sweat, DeMarcus Walker, Dominique Robinson, Jake Martin, Khalid Kareem, and Daniel Hardy. Like, they don't really have anybody else besides Sweat and Walker that you feel great about. But if you went into this draft and got Dallas Turner, Leatu Latu, just Jared Verse, or some kind of premier pass rusher to be the starter opposite Montez Sweat, then essentially you have DeMarcus Walker being your rotational defensive end and rotational defensive tackle. Like, he'll be your number 3 end, the first guy off the bench at defensive end, and your first guy off the bench at defensive tackle. So he's going to play quite a few snaps still as a result, but not have to be the starter. Can be the go-to backup for Dexter when he needs a break, the go-to backup for Sweat when he needs a break, or the go-to backup for the rookie that you draft at defensive end when he needs a break. Like, can you address defensive end well enough that that DeMarcus Walker is freed up then to be that co-defensive tackle with Gervon Dexter and kind of build together then a defensive line with some positional versatility? I wonder, too, is there any room for occasionally Montez Sweat to kick inside to defensive tackle? The Bears did it maybe 10 times all season last year. Like, it was really, really rare. And he's only like 260 pounds is what he's listed at. So he's not big enough to hold up there, on 1st and 10 in a running situation. But like, when it's third and long, that the offense is going to pass. Could you get away with putting Montez Sweat in, rotating him inside the defensive end and kind of use a NASCAR package that way where you go a little bit lighter? I feel like he could do it. Again, we haven't seen him do it a ton, but I feel like you could do it more. And so again, if you have other defensive ends that are good, you could take your defensive ends and rotate them into inside and just go with more defensive ends on the field since you don't now have an ability to really fully address the defensive tackle position. That to me feels like the best scenario for the Bears team right now. The other option would be like if you traded down, I think a rookie defensive lineman like Darius Robinson from Missouri, who we talked about on the Big Board podcast yesterday. He's like, I don't know his height, is like 6'3", 6'4", 280. He's a hybrid guy who could play defensive end or defensive tackle. And in that case, you're using a first-round pick on a guy that can play both positions, kind of like DeMarcus Walker. So again, it doesn't feel like you're overly investing in a Gervon Dexter replacement because he's able to play both spots. Like, there's an ability to potentially do that. Or potentially, if you trade down from 9 and pick up a second-round pick, could you draft a defensive end in the first round and then a defensive tackle in the second round and then still be good? Or you can still draft a defensive tackle in the 3rd or 4th round. I just like to do more than that. Like, address defensive tackle in some way, sure, but I can't just say Dexter and a 4th-round pick is enough right now. Like, I need defensive end addressed so that I can rotate guys inside more and get more of a consistent outside pass rush so that Dexter and Billings and Pickens on the interior have more of an ability to get after the quarterback and have less focus from the opposing offensive line trying to stop them. None of those sound like perfect solutions. It would have been ideal to address the defensive tackle position more directly in free agency. And again, I understand like Ryan Poles can't do everything all the time and sign everybody that you want him to sign and address all the positions perfectly. But it did feel like there were enough free agent defensive tackles that weren't that expensive that they could have afforded even a lower level veteran. We talked about Quentin Jefferson a lot on this podcast as a guy who would have fit that bill. He's not going to be your head and shoulders way better than Gervon Dexter, but just a veteran to rotate in with him. So you feel like you got 2 quality players there, but they declined to really address that in any super meaningful way. And it feels like Ryan Poles has missed that window now. So it's on to the NFL draft to finish the Chicago Bears defensive line. We'll see. I'm sure he's got plans in his head. He's got backup plans. He's got to feel comfortable with the defensive line in some way, shape, or form, and any big moves they make up front, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. I want to hear from you, though, on what you think the Bears should do with the defensive line. Is there a pick you really want to see them make? Is there a free agent you want to see them sign? How much do you trust Gervon Dexter as that starting three-technique defensive tackle? How much do you trust DeMarcus Walker as potentially your starting defensive end opposite Montez Sweat? Let me know in the comments here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, or you can tweet us at Locked On Bears, or you can post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group. However you do it, make sure you hit the subscribe button, whether you're watching the Locked On Bears YouTube channel or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We bring you your Bears talk every single day. I'm setting up some interviews. It won't be tomorrow's podcast, but we're going to talk to Derek Clausen of Bleacher Report, who scouts quarterbacks. We're going to get into this quarterback class and kind of compare and contrast Caleb Williams with the likes of Drake May and Jaden Daniels and why the Bears are leaning the direction they are. At some point, we're going to talk to friend of the show, Matt Waldman, about his rookie scouting portfolio and some of the comparisons between how he evaluates Caleb Williams and Patrick Mahomes. Not that he puts them in the same category at all, but he's got some really good perspective on what makes those quarterbacks different and what makes them similar. So that's coming down the pipeline as well. And some other good draft folks that are going to break down this draft class for us right here in the podcast. So come on back for those. And you have to come back every day for another opportunity to bear down.